Okay, so we're going to go right into session 3, changes in how terrorists behave. We have an awesome 2-person panel. We only have 30 minutes, and so they are going to get right to it. These 2 experts on today's panel will speak to their cutting-edge research on this topic with a focus on implications for the emerging terror landscape. Speaking on recruiting patterns will be Alec Worsnop, a political scientist at the University of Maryland. And then telling us about the Provisional Irish Republican Army and the Oath Keepers will be Patrick Finnegan, and he is from the University of Lincoln. And this is not Lincoln, Nebraska. No, University of Lincoln. So take it away, guys.
So thank you very much for having us. I look forward to talking a little bit about this. This is going to be kind of a synopsis of a project that Evan, Meredith Loken, and I have been working on, and Patrick actually did some research as part of this grant as well, too. So just imagine, we feel very lonely up here if anybody wants to join us, but just imagine Evan and Meredith are sitting down there as well too. So Evan's at the University of Connecticut, Meredith is at the University of Amsterdam. So the kind of general purpose or kind of motivating theme of this project comes out of a lot of what we've talked about so far today, right? We know that insurgent groups, terrorist groups look for all sorts of different skill sets. They need all sorts of different skills, both at different points in the conflict and throughout. What we know a lot less about is thinking about what the long-term effects of recruiting based on different skills are for how terrorists develop, right? Whether we have these path-dependent processes or if groups end up changing how they behave, how they target, how violent they are because of those people they're onboarding to take care of tasks, right, that they need to be done. And so this is a general question we have across armed groups, right, kind of globally, but it also speaks a lot to thinking about a set of nascent armed groups in the United States and domestic violent extremists in particular, right? So what can we learn about how the recruitment profiles of fighters actually shape the way organizations end up developing? Okay, so the general purpose of the project is to figure out the kind of general idea of the variation, and then more importantly, think about what that variation means, right? So we think about how recruitment patterns vary in terms of variables like military and technical expertise, religion, ideology, gender, and so on and so forth, right? And then there are 3 things we want to do with it. So last year we started collecting kind of expert analysis on how these various factors might influence insurgent groups. So Patrick wrote one of our reports, right, about kind of professionalization and military experience. We had others about ideology, gender, religion, age of members to get a sense, right, of which of these variables likely are having major influence on how organizations operate and how they develop. In the moment, we're in the middle of collecting kind of a large end snapshot of about 300 groups, armed groups worldwide, to get a sense of how they're explicitly recruiting based on different characteristics like this, right? That will help us to map out both the extent of variation, but also what's the meaningful kind of the real world implications of this happening. And finally, right, with this foundation, we're hoping to spend, or we're planning to spend next year thinking about how some of these lessons might tell us about nascent or developing domestic violent extremists in the US. In general, the core, if we have one core takeaway, right, is that who fights actually matters and has unintended and long-term consequences for these groups. So I'm going to talk about kind of an example of what this large end data collection looks like to give you a sense of what that variation is, and then talk about an example of how this actually shapes organizational profiles by kind of quickly recounting a paper that we have forthcoming on security studies that kind of draws on exactly this. Okay? So right here, we just have a kind of quick snapshot of what our data collection effort looks like for the country of Somalia. This was actually prepared by an undergrad at UConn who is now going to come to the University of Maryland as a Ph.D. student. So we're doing a good job of moving students between our institutions. And what we see here is a kind of 3 really important takeaways. The first is that there's a lot of variation across the groups in Somalia, despite having relatively similar ideological bents in this sort of thing, right? The second is you can see that the kind of shaded squares are squares where our RAs are less sure about it. And so this should be apparent to everybody in this room, and everybody knows this, but just being cognizant of the fact that we're rarely getting a great snapshot of what organizations are doing in real time and what they focus on. Right. And then the kind of 4th piece of this is thinking about the ways in which it's meaningful, right? So Will, our RA, kind of writes a lot about how, in particular, SPM, the Somali Patriotic Movement, has had a real problem right, competing with a lot of these other groups because it hasn't been recruiting women. A lot of these other groups have changed to have a lot more gender equity in how they're recruiting, and this has had meaningful effects on the battlefield for it. And so just to kind of more broadly get a sense of what we're doing across all these 300 groups, right, we can see this snapshot in Somalia and recognize, right, that there's utility in this and that there's actually unexpected variation in groups that look relatively similar in a lot of ways. Okay. So the second thing that I kind of want to talk through in a bit more detail is thinking through the extent to which who you recruit reshapes how the organization works. And so this kind of draws on a quick summary of this paper, Veterans, Novices, and Patterns of Rebel Recruitment, that tracks how the recruitment of veteran fighters, so skilled fighters in particular, changed how the Al-Qaeda in Iraq and its follow-on organization, the Islamic State, operated in Iraq, and how some of these changes were both useful for the organization, but some of them were quite challenging as well too. So we have this movement from Zarqawi on the, I can't turn around, that would be on your left, right? And to kind of the broader movement warfare of the Islamic State. And to be able to do this, both of these groups ended up recruiting a lot of very skilled fighters with a lot of combat experience, right? So what were the implications of this? How did this kind of play out in terms of how the groups operated? So in terms of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the predecessor to the Islamic State, in some ways, they're dealing with this bountiful harvest when they start coming to power or start fighting in 2003 and 2004, right? The Iraqi army has been disbanded. You have a lot of really skilled Iraqi recruits that are potentially well-trained and could join the insurgency. Zarqawi has a problem with them, though, right? He's saying that their previous military experience and their previous understanding of how to deploy force is at odds with the operational kind of approach or tactical approach of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? So he said, unfortunately, right, the folks here in Iraq right now are using mines that are planted, rockets launched, and mortars shelling from afar. They still prefer safety and returning to their arms of their wives, right? So the idea is they're preferring operational profiles that are less risky. And this is a major problem for Al-Qaeda in Iraq in the kind of 2003, 2004, 2005 period. They are getting people with combat experience, but they're having a lot of trouble convincing them to carry out the types of operations that Al-Qaeda in Iraq wants to carry out. And this leads to a kind of change in the way in which they're approaching the conflict in 2006, 2007, and actually begins to lay the groundwork for the Islamic State, right? You have different people on board in the organization that prefer different sorts of operational profiles, and they're pushing towards that. And so what's interesting about this is that Zarqawi recognized this in real time. And that was really useful for us to understand that insurgent leaders care about this. And then second, that despite that, right, he had a lot of trouble. Despite recognizing these potential concerns, right, he had trouble actually stopping the effects from these incoming recruits from happening. And we saw this happen again as the Islamic State transitioned from kind of an insurgency towards movement warfare. So a huge part of this transition to movement warfare actually came from the recruitment of Chechen fighters and other fighters from the broader Russian Caucasus. And they were very useful because they experienced fighting Russian forces, but they brought a very different set of perspectives on conflict, right? And so Omar al-Shishani, one of the more famous Chechen fighters in the Islamic State, right, said in the statement the day before he was killed, he was reminding the leadership of the Islamic State that don't forget about the Caucasus. And this actually played out. The Islamic State shifted a lot and started treating Russia as a major enemy of the Islamic State, which strategically made very little sense in the context of what they're doing in Iraq and Syria, but was driven by the influx of new recruits that they had right there. And more broadly, Chechen fighters led to different operational kind of training schemes. They were training for operations that they thought would be useful in Iraq in Syria, but also in Russia or in Chechnya when they go back. So you see this shift in how they're trying to recruit. And so this is in part about foreign fighters, but we actually see this within the organization more broadly. So Ido Levy and a lot of new research has kind of demonstrated that a lot of the shift to movement warfare that was attributed to Ba'ath or Saddam Hussein-trained Iraqi fighters wasn't really coming from that, right? These fighters that ended up being prominent in the Islamic State didn't have conventional and movement experience. What they did have was pretty strong sets of experience fighting the insurgency after 2003, right? So they looked very different in terms of what their role was. And so more broadly, right, we see that who you're kind of bringing on board actually matters a lot in terms of how you develop. And it had meaningful implications for how the Islamic State developed. And so more broadly, the project kind of tries to look at this perspective beyond just military skill and to other things as well too. And so Patrick is going to speak to this quite well in terms of contrasting a group like the PIRA with the Oath Keepers and thinking about, right, who you're recruiting, how does that shape how you end up developing, and what should we know about that as we're viewing a lot of nascent domestic violent extremist groups in the US and elsewhere.
I think I'm already up. Hi everyone, hope you can hear me. Yeah, Dr. Patrick Finnegan. I'm from the other University of Lincoln, as was already mentioned. So I have no stake in the local rivalries, but if someone pays me, I will come and have a go. And in true academic fashion, having submitted my slides, I decided almost instantly that there was a far better title that I could have used. I'm torn between two of them right now, so I will do a straw poll at the end of the day about which actually works. And it's about performance, not performing, or it's technical skills, not tactical, which is kind of the point I'm trying to get to here. And before I get too far into it, I just want to say, I was brought into Alec's project as someone who is a historian by trade, but studies in organizational behavior, and perhaps most importantly, wasn't American, and was therefore to kind of challenge some of the kind of standard thinking that was in the area about how do you deal with right wing, how do you deal with left wing, how do you deal with American threats versus historical, much more long-lived incidences. So, core things I was looking at was educational and professional background to see if they seemed to make any difference in the long term about what was going on. It was a largely a qualitative project, but I have some stats for those who like graphs. And the idea was compare a campaign that was over and a campaign that we could say is still ongoing or has been stalled, but more importantly, a heavy civilian organization and a heavily military or securitized organization. And although the kind of central theme was drawing from the military seems to be the most threatening thing that an organization could do because all those skills are ready-made, they're readily employable and everything else. But is it any different to any other professional background? And a lot of it depends on what you're actually trying to do. So for those who aren't aware, Provisional IRA or the RA, I'm trying not to be another Irish guy who talks about the RA all the time. But I was asked to make this comparison, so I've made it, and I think it's actually worthwhile doing. For those who didn't know, the IRA conducted a multi-decade-long campaign against a Western European government that was trying very hard to suppress it. This wasn't something that was just being let bubble away. And it took 30 years to reach stalemate, never mind defeat. Their approach was quite different to the Oath Keepers, so rather than trying to be very distinct from society, it tried to blend in. And it had targeted recruitment, but it wasn't based on military backgrounds. It was based on utility. And as I'll say later on, throughout its transformation, the IRA became very task cohesion focused, not socially cohesive. And it also developed its own organic training system because it knew it was in a long-haul conflict. And if you take 5 years to train someone, it takes 5 years to train someone. They had that longevity. Meanwhile, the Oath Keepers, on the other hand, deliberately targeting police, sheriffs, customs, whatever it might be, particularly the military. Although rarely engaging in conflict, there are cases of Oath Keepers engaging in violence, and they have a strategy, or at least did, of disavowing members who engage in violence because I try to argue it's about performance, or it's about being performative in that case, whereas the IRA was about performance. Can you do the job? And that's, I think, a key distinction that gets left out. I'm also aware we're prone to death by PowerPoint, so I'm going to try and focus on the bolded points throughout the discussion rather than reading everything. But for those who aren't particularly familiar with this side of academia, there is no real correlation between being completely educationless or completely destitute and joining a terror group. The easy idea of the poorest places produce the most violence just isn't accurate. What matters, and reflects the talks that happened earlier on, having a grievance, having some aspirations that you just can't achieve, and you then target the system and you try to claw back some of that control that you think you have lost. So I think that's important to remember, that all of the groups that we're looking at, it's people who, as was already mentioned, what they think, or what they're doing, they think makes sense. And it's about moderate levels of education and relative deprivation, everything else. That said, it's fairly useful if you're a bomb maker to be an electrician. And that kind of trade is really useful rather than simply reading lots of books about electrical engineering. And within that, we also have a massive distinction between the leaders of organizations who contemporarily tend to be very highly trained engineers, PhDs in mechanical and electrical engineering and everything else, but the foot soldiers aren't. There are people who are using everyday skills. And to highlight another trend that quickly came up in the last panel is a lot of this isn't new. We know it's been going on for quite some time, but we sometimes get wrapped up in recent events or in trends that we're trying to explain that I think rather than revolutionize everything, it's a deepening of something. And I love this quote that I got from the archives that maybe they'll let me back one day when they realize I found this. British Security Review in the mid-80s of trying to directly address the idea of how do we prevent these people becoming terrorists? Or we'll give them jobs, we'll support money, we'll support training, everything else. And then a senior British Army officer said, there is no correlation with educational disadvantage. Better education does not cure terrorism, it only produces better educated terrorists. Which, if you're British at that point in time, is a very bad thing. Whereas if you are growing up in Belfast and the only way you can get education is via a British government-funded vocational course, you're going to join it. And maybe you'll become an electrician, maybe you'll become a bomb maker, maybe you'll be both at different times of the day. And that's kind of the point that I'm really trying to get at. A couple of points, but the big thing for my perspective of PIRA is they went from being a robust organization to a resilient one, and knew it was going to have to wax and wane with the security environment. It became much more adaptable to its context than other organizations have, and that's what allowed it to be so long-lived. And how it does that is by making, as I've said here, substantial use of the everyday for its subversive needs. It subverted supply chains, it subverted educational systems, it subverted educational funding, the same way that a lot of other organizations are doing it, but we don't necessarily want to focus in on that because we want to look at the training camp. We want to look at the online propagandists rather than people down the local recreation center, people at the gym or whatever, having these same conversations. And for the stats to show why this matters, this is a list, or a breakdown of the casualties suffered by the IRA recorded. There's probably slightly more, but these are those who were recorded as having died. Blue is the kind of total, and orange is the proportion that was self-inflicted. I think this is really important because we tend to focus on how good we are at stopping other organizations from doing things we don't like them to do, like bombing cities. But most bomb makers kill themselves at some point. And if you're an organization that wants to have a 30-year campaign, you need to get better at doing these things. And in the period up to 1977, the IRA killed one member in every 2 attacks. After 1977, when they reorganized, it was 1 in every 50. So massive change, and that is not due to a reduction in activity. Thank you to the Global Terrorism Database for this information, by the way. As you can see, the IRA conducted more and more attacks as its life went on. So it was becoming smaller, it was killing itself a lot less, and was able to engage in a lot more activities because it stepped away from big, showy things and became much more strategically oriented about how do we achieve our objectives and how do we get the right people into the right place. Oath Keepers, on the other hand, and this is where me being the outsider potentially helps, potentially hinders, is although they've been limited, they have been operationally more limited. They have a much more blatant focus on recruiting security personnel, military personnel, and that would be great if you were going to engage in military-like behavior. If you're going to conduct clearances of buildings and convoy ambushes and all those kinds, that would be fantastic. But they don't seem to be doing that. And instead, it's just the show. It's the tactical element of, I'm big, I have a tactical vest, I've got a weapon that I can buy down the street that is a particularly American thing that I can do, but it's all about intimidation. And from a strat studies perspective, what happens when intimidation fails? Largely speaking, in the data, they just go home. Or there's a standoff that the media focuses on for a couple of weeks, and then it just peters out. So although Oath Keepers and violent members of the far right are very robust organizations, I wouldn't particularly want to go facing off on them on one-to-one. But if the system or the organization is designed for a particular context, if that context changes, you become less robust and you become less successful, broadly speaking. And this should move on. And given the context we're talking about, on the left is the Oklahoma City bombing, and then on the right-hand side is one of the bombings in London. One conducted by an ex-military veteran, or a military veteran, the other a couple of civilians who are farmers and electricians, both using fertilizer bombs, both using trucks. Both, in this instance at least, being a military veteran, having that job made zero difference at all. So focusing on the big, high-profile, flashy image of a veteran doing this would have given us zero predictive ability, because it was a load of lads who are on the same football team then engaging in this violence at the weekend, and then they went back to their day jobs the very next day. So the point I'm trying to raise all this is focusing on the most emergent tech, or focusing on the latest big thing, can potentially blind us to very simple applications of technology being used to dramatic effect. And even if we look at more recent events in the UK, such as the Manchester bombing, it's one guy with a backpack that has used store-bought chemicals to do what he did. So to finish, I think diverse backgrounds, not focusing solely on one, gives you a greater level of human capital. This increases your innovative ability, and that diversity will more likely come from vocational training than it will from university education or having a PhD in whatever it might be. And in terms of who you recruit matters, being task-orientated is much more dangerous than being socially orientated. And to be task-orientated, you do not need to be a military veteran. You can be a very, very good plumber and still be a very effective terrorist. It doesn't matter that you served in whatever elite unit or the National Guard or whatever it might be. What matters is, do you have the right skills for the job at the time, rather than just looking very imposing. And hopefully that was 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions for these guys? Oh, from Martha Crenshaw. No one else gets to ask a question.
Erin, you embarrass me. So my question is a very basic one, which is, what does your research have to say about terrorist use of emerging technologies, especially Patrick?
No pressure. So to me, I think it's, as the point was made earlier, criminals are going to use emerging technology the same way civilians use emerging technology to do whatever we want to do. And I think it's about, trying to understand the time lag between a new technology emerging and finding the utility in a violent context. That time seems to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but the same way we heard about the internet earlier on, the printing press was that discussion 50 years ago, 60 years ago. So I think violent groups will continue to try and test, 3D printed materials, cardboard drones to avoid metal detectors, and all the things that we're seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere. Terror groups will try to employ them in the next coming years, but we will have security apparatuses that will also respond to that. The cat and mouse game will continue, and we will see shifts where one side has the advantage over the other, but it's about that innovative capability. And if we focus too narrowly on very specific parts of an organization, we might be very good at targeting that, but the broader organization can still adapt and change and get round our very kind of focused and efficient methods of targeting them. And if we focus solely on keeping things cheap and quick and effective to respond to particular threats, we might lose sight of the broader risks. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I'll just kind of to add to that a little bit more broadly as well too, right? If we think about increasingly specific and technical expertise, the Venn diagram of overlap between have expertise, want to join organization, right, gets smaller and smaller. And so I think the broader project is thinking through the implications of recruiting from smaller and smaller pools of skilled folks and seeing what happens. And so we've seen this, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan recruited quite substantially from their existing social networks at the beginning of the conflict because they felt comfortable with them. As they start recruiting from different networks, both Pakistani madrasa networks, but also more local non-religious networks, we have major changes in how they approach conflict. Some of those ended up being very good for how the Taliban fought, despite our best efforts. So it's a really important question of thinking about what do you do with this level of expertise, what do you do to get this level of expertise, and how much control do you have of those people once they join your organization, right? They have a big trump card. They know how to do this. So, yeah.
We've got a question online. Blake?
Yeah, we have a question from our online viewers, one online viewer. What is known, if anything, about the effectiveness of recruitment efforts in general by such groups? Do we know anything about their failures?
Yeah, so this is, you can speak to this too.
By which groups?
By armed groups, I think.
You go first. Let me
Okay. So the first thing that I kind of want to respond to with that is this relates to something Patrick said, that I already felt very bad about my life choice of getting a PhD, so I really didn't appreciate you making it even worse, that I have no useful real-world skills. But it's actually kind of related to answering this question a little bit, right? Is that the literature on insurgent recruitment has focused a lot on questions about this, right? About how you get the right people. And so we have this basic distinction between this idea of, are you being recruited into a group because you want to get paid, because you want to hold a gun, versus are you getting recruited into groups based on whether you're committed to the group. And we see major variation in the ability of organizations to control their fighters, right? Those that are joining for financial gain or because they want to be tactical, in Patrick's kind of parlance, right, tend to not be as reliable and motivated fighters over time. On the other hand, another thing our project points to as well too is that organizations, and a lot of existing research has kind of found this, that are not adaptive in their recruitment, so they recruit a lot of folks with military skill, but then they have to start governing, but they don't want to do that, tend to run into real problems, right? The same way that having military skill or kind of small unit military skill doesn't necessarily make you good at making a fertilizer bomb, right? Being a good combat fighter doesn't necessarily make you a good mayor or something like that as well too. So those are kind of two dynamics related to this project, but more broadly, right, we see that insurgents tend to have a lot of attrition, they have to recruit a lot, and so their ability to do that has major implications for whether they persist and how they end up fighting.
Yeah, just add to that. I think it depends a lot on the intensity of the campaign as well. If you are going for a large insurgency, then you're largely going to have an open door policy and get in, we need numbers, all this kind of stuff. If you are being the more focused terror-style campaign, then you're probably going to be a lot more selective, and there will be a lot of failed recruitment efforts in the sense of you might target individuals with particular skills and they aren't interested in your campaign because if you're able to target educational institutions, like I was suggesting about the subversion, society probably isn't on the brink of collapse, but you're still trying to conduct a campaign. But on the other side, if you are trying to blend into society and subvert, you're not going to let anyone join just because they want to join, especially if the organization has professionalized in the sense that it doesn't want people with financial motivation. It wants people to sacrifice for it, not to gain via the use of its kind of apparatus instead.
I'm afraid we have one more, but I hate to do this to you. We are out of time because we have another panel. But will you promise you two hook up with her after we have a break in half an hour and just ask your question to them directly? And I will ask you, did they answer your question? And you just be honest. You tell me. And if they didn't, I'll chase them down.
I'm afraid of you now, too.
You should be. Okay, we're going to have Seamus Hughes and Aaron Carnes come join us. Thank you guys for...